Good evening, my name is McMillan and I'm a student in the Postgraduate Certificate Occupational Health and Safety course at ECU University. Tonight we'll be doing a presentation on the history of occupational health and safety, assisted by
Jay Parfit
and the lovely
Irene Parfit.
Cool. So we'll kick it off. So as I said earlier, we're going to be covering a 15-minute presentation on the occupational health and safety and the history of it. The outcomes. During this presentation we'll discuss a brief history of OH&S in Australia, the factors that have influenced the development of related laws, current Queensland mining health and safety regulation legal framework, and the names of the Act and regulations pertaining to the Queensland mining industry today. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to complete a questionnaire pertaining to those points above. A brief history of OH&S in Australia. Initially, Australian states adopted most of the provisions of the 19th century Rubin's Health and Safety legislation, 19th century British Health and Safety legislation. British legislation was based on a very detailed and highly technical specification of standards. It was enforced by independent state inspectors that only had broad inspection powers and mainly relied on negotiated compliance using informal enforcement methods like advice, education and persuasion. And as a last resort, they would use the provisions of criminal law for prosecution. In 1972, the Romans Report proposed changes to the OH&S regulatory model in the United Kingdom, which was ultimately adopted in Australia and known as the Rubin's Report 1972. The traditional OH&S model was criticised for a few reasons, and some of those reasons are it had too many detailed and technical rules which were difficult to understand and hard to keep up to date, so it's pretty hard to understand it. It had ad hoc standard setting that resulted in being inconsistency, so it was inconsistent with other OH&S laws and legislation. It did not encourage locally initiative solutions to OH&S problems, and there was insufficient involvement by workers or unions, so it was more or less a dictatorship of law and legislation. The report proposed legislation that created broad general duties for employers, the self-employed, occupiers, manufacturers, suppliers and designers of plant and substances, and employees, which also had standards, regulations and codes of practice. So as you can see, it's very complex. A united OH&S inspectorate was to have new administrative sanctions, for example, improvement and prohibition notices, which helped supplement prosecution instead of going to criminal law. Prosecutions were able to be brought against corporate officers as well as a corporate employer. So you couldn't just be, charge corporate officers if they were negligent in their duties according to the new legislation. So in summary, the Romans Report proposed a system that was less prescriptive and more effectively self-regulating. Cooperation between employers and employees was identified as a crucial success to the new law. Specifically, there should be a statutory duty of every employer to consult with employees or their representatives at the workplace on measures for promoting safety and health at work, and to provide the participation of employees in the development of such measures, as per the Romans Report 1972, paragraph 7. Stop on your nose. Sorry about that. Okay, questions. So now we're going to summarise that history and see if we had an understanding of what we just talked about. Okay, so what year, J, was the Rubin's Report adopted in the United Kingdom?
I believe it was 1972.
Speak up.
I believe it was 1972.
Correct. Well done. As a last resort, state inspectors used what law for prosecution? Young lady in front.
Criminal law.
Well done. Is she right?
Yes.
Correct. Well done. Okay. What was one of the 4 reasons the traditional OH&S model was criticised for?
It was too hard to understand.
Good.
Yeah.
Jane, how are you doing?
It was inconsistent.
Cool. Well done. Moving on. Well done. So impressed. Okay. Factors that have influenced the development of laws. Okay. On the 23rd of March 1887, a gas explosion in the Bully mine killed 81 men and boys, leaving 50 women widows and 150 children without fathers. There was one survivor, a 17-year-old boy who became known as Boy Cope. The mine reopened later that year. The Bully mine disaster was one of the worst in the region's history. Still waiting on ours. Factors that have influenced the development of OHS laws. Another one was an explosion at 2 p.m. on July 31st, 1902 at Mount Kembla, Collie. It killed 96 men and boys. The sound of the explosion could be heard in Wollongong, which was some 7 miles away. At the end of the day, 33 women were widows and 120 children were fatherless. The Mount Mulligan mine disaster occurred on the 19th September 1921 at Mount Mulligan. 75 workers were killed by the disaster. 4 of the dead had been at the mouth of the pit at the time of the explosion. Only 11 of the bodies were ever found. The disaster affected people in cities and towns over the country. The mine, which was new at the time of the accident, was widely considered safe and had no previous indications of gas leaks. The miners hence worked using open flame lights instead of safety lamps. Law and legislation has been introduced throughout Australia for a variety of reasons. None more persuasive than a person's right to be safe whilst at the workplace. People have been killed or injured in the workplace, and it is not acceptable at any time. As such, the public pressure over time has influenced governments to improve working conditions and amend laws. So, do you understand that, Joe? Why it's changed?
Yeah.
Cool. Questions? Explain in your own words a factor that may have influenced OH&S reform and why. Joe. Help him out, young lady?
Well, I'd say they introduced it because there was so much injury and death and no one was accountable.
Cool. Jay, since you got the first one so wrong, you can answer the second one,
Oh my God.
which is there was one survivor of the Bully mine disaster, a 17-year-old boy who became known as who?
Coop boy or boy coop?
Boy Cope.
Coop,
Okay.
alright.
Okay. So what that whole section is saying is the legislation was influenced by the death of so many people. That's not the only reason that mining, or correction, that law and legislation was influenced, but it's a big one. Because when people get hurt, that gives people the power to persuade governments to do the right thing. So that was what I conceived as the main one. Okay, mining, the next thing we're going to cover is mining work, health and safety legal framework. So this is the legal framework of mining. And we do mining, why? Because who works in the mining industry? Okay, in 2008, the National Mine Framework, better known as the NMSF, was introduced, included as a Council of Australian Governments, the COAG, regulatory reform policy, priority. Sorry. Most states regulate mine safety under the National Model Work Health and Safety legislation, the Model Act, with the major mining states of Queensland, New South Wales and West Australia developing additional NMSF non-core provisions suitable for extensive mining operations. So basically what it's saying is mining's got its own legislation because it's so broad and there's a few different reasons, but it has a standalone legislation. The 3 options considered to implement mine safety legislation in Queensland. So before going further, so currently we have the Work Health and Safety Act 2011 is our legislation here in Queensland. Mining has a standalone legislation, and with the harmonisation of Australia, which was bringing together all the safety legislation and laws throughout the country, so we had one harmonised legislation. Stop smiling, the camera. So we had one lot of legislation, one lot of law. So what they're trying to say now is that the government wants everyone to work under that legislation, but Queensland coal mining and New South Wales coal mining, but Queensland, which I know a bit more about, has turned around and said, no, we don't want to adopt the harmonisation because we've worked so long over the last 20, 30 years to get our legislation up here, so there's no accidents anymore, or very few accidents or incidents. So these are the provisions that they're putting forward. So they've said to the government, so forth, that option 1 is to retain the current Coal Mine Health and Safety Act 1999 and the Mining Inquiry Safety Act 1999. Collectively, the Queensland Acts for the coal and metalliferous sectors, plus the NMSF provisions that improve safety and consistency. So what they're saying is we want to keep the Act now because we've worked on it for so many years and it works. Option 2, have one single act for coal mining and metalliferous sectors, plus any NMSF provisions that improve safety and consistency. So we'll keep the Act, but you've got to give us stuff to improve it. And option 3, develop mine safety legislation primarily based on the Model Act, plus any provisions that improve the safety and consistency. Okay, the Queensland is committed to the NMSF process to achieving greater consistency in the mining and health legislation with other states. However, Queensland has made it clear it will not accept any lowering of its standards. Queensland's commitment to the NMSF is guided by 2 principles. The new legislation must result in a clear improvement in safety outcomes, or at the very least, no dilution or diminution in safety standards within Queensland. The new legislation must not impose any additional cost on either government or industry as a result of its introduction. Queensland mining industry consistently improving safety and health statistics since 2002 is an indicator that industry generally has made significant efforts to make improvements. So why change it? The Coal Mining Safety and Health Act 1999 and the Mining Inquiry Safety Health Act 1999 and regulations have provided a sound regulatory framework for the improvement in safety performance. Okay, so in mining, the legislation I use and that all other miners use is the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act 2011, correction 1999, the Coal Mine Safety Health Regulation 2001, the Mining Inquiry Safety and Health Act 1999, the Mining Inquiry Safety Health Regulation 2001, Queensland Work Health and Safety Act 2011, and Work Health and Safety Regulation 2011. So that's the law that governs everything I do at work. Questions before our final exams. Let's see how we go this time, children. Okay, question. In what the National Mine Safety Framework was introduced, included as a Council of Australian Government's regulatory reform priority?
2008.
Man, good students I had today. Queensland's commitment to the NMSF is guided by 2 principles, which are...
legislation must be in a clear legislation must in a clear improvement in safety and mustn't cost anymore.
Cool, that's 2. So it mustn't cost anymore. This is what Queensland's saying to the government. We'll take on your safety regulations and laws, but it mustn't cost us any more, and it must improve safety. It mustn't go backwards. Okay, so name one piece of Queensland mining legal framework. So what's one of the laws that I have to abide by, a piece of law that I have to stick?
The Coal Safety and Health Act 1999, Queensland.
Well done. Jim.
I don't want me to answer them, okay. Work Health and Safety Regulation 2011.
Cool. That's fantastic. So, what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn the video off, so thank you very much for your attendance, and we shall complete an assessment questionnaire.